The gold band on Margaret Davies's finger caught the afternoon sun as she stood outside the Silverton, Colorado trading post, her hand trembling while she twisted the ring one final time before letting it go forever. She had walked 3 miles from her small claim at the edge of town, the dusty trail familiar beneath her worn boots, though the journey felt different this May afternoon in 1881. Every step had been heavier than the last, weighted with the knowledge of what she was about to do. The ring had been on her finger for 5 years, placed there by Thomas Davies on their wedding day back in Kansas, before they had ventured west with dreams of silver and a new life together. Those dreams had died with him 6 months ago when a mining accident took him and 4 other men into the darkness of the mountain. Their bodies never recovered from the collapsed shaft. Margaret paused at the door of the trading post, her throat tight. She was 23 years old and alone in a territory that showed little mercy to women without means. The small savings Thomas had put aside were gone, spent on survival through the harsh Colorado winter. Her garden was just beginning to show promise, but it would be weeks before she could harvest anything substantial. The chickens she kept provided eggs, but the feed was running low. She owed money to the general store, to the man who owned the land her small cabin sat upon, and to the kind widow who had helped nurse her through a fever in March. The ring was all she had left of value. She pushed through the door, the bell above jingling cheerfully, a sound that felt wrong given her errand. Inside, the trading post smelled of leather, tobacco, and the earthy scent of potatoes stored in burlap sacks. Caleb Morrison stood behind the counter, his weathered face creasing with concern when he saw her. "Mrs. Davies," he greeted, his tone gentle. "What brings you in today?" Margaret approached the counter, her fingers moving to the ring. She pulled it from her finger slowly, the gold sliding over her knuckle for the first time since Thomas had placed it there. The absence of its weight felt like losing him all over again. "I need to sell this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She set the ring on the wooden counter, unable to meet Morrison's eyes. The shopkeeper picked up the ring, examining it with practiced care. Margaret knew what he saw: a simple gold band, no ornamentation, no gems, just honest gold worn smooth by years of wear. "Mrs. Davies, are you certain?" "This was your husband's gift." "I am certain I need to eat," Margaret replied, lifting her chin despite the tears threatening to fall. "I am certain I need to pay my debts. The sentiment of the thing does not fill my stomach or keep the roof over my head." Morrison nodded slowly. "I understand. Times are hard. I can offer you $40 for it." $40. It was not enough to solve all her problems, but it would buy her time. Time to find work, time to make her garden productive, time to figure out how to survive in this unforgiving place. "I will take it," she said. Morrison disappeared into the back room to get the money from his safe. Margaret stood alone in the trading post, staring at the ring on the counter. 5 years of marriage, 5 years of love and hope and partnership, reduced to $40 in gold coins. She thought of Thomas's laugh, the way he used to pull her close on cold mornings, his dreams of striking it rich in the silver mines. He had been a good man, a kind husband. He deserved better than this ending. The door of the trading post opened behind her, bringing with it the sound of spurs and boots. Margaret did not turn, too focused on keeping her composure, but she heard the footsteps approach and stop a respectful distance behind her. Morrison returned with a small leather pouch, counting out the coins onto the counter. $40 in gold and silver, gleaming in the dim light of the shop. "There you are, Mrs. Davies," Morrison said. "I am sorry it has come to this." Margaret reached for the money, but a different hand moved first. A man's hand, sun-bronzed and calloused, picked up the ring before she could touch the coins. She turned quickly, startled, and found herself looking up at a cowboy she had never seen before. He was tall, with dark hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of aged whiskey. His face was handsome in a rough-hewn way, with strong features and the weathered look of a man who spent his life outdoors. He wore typical range clothes, worn denim pants, a cotton shirt, a leather vest, and a wide-brimmed hat he had removed upon entering the shop. A gun belt sat low on his hips, the holster tied down against his thigh. He could not have been much older than 30. "Excuse me," Margaret said sharply, surprise making her bold. "That is mine." The cowboy studied the ring, turning it in the light, then looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "You are selling it." "That is what I said to Mr. Morrison, yes." "Why?" The audacity of the question took her breath away. "I fail to see how that is any of your concern." "Madam, I apologize for the intrusion," the cowboy said, his voice low and calm. "But a woman does not sell her wedding ring unless she is desperate. I am simply trying to understand the situation." "The situation is that I am a widow trying to survive," Margaret said, heat rising in her cheeks. "Now if you will please return my ring so I can complete my transaction." The cowboy looked at Morrison. $40. "That is what I offered, yes," Morrison confirmed. "I will give you 50 for it," the cowboy said, still addressing the shopkeeper but watching Margaret. "No," Margaret interjected. "Mr. Morrison and I had an agreement." 55, the cowboy continued, ignoring her protest. He pulled a leather wallet from his vest pocket. $60, and I will take it now." Margaret's heart pounded. $60 was 20 more than Morrison had offered, money that could make a real difference. But something about the transaction felt wrong. She did not know this man, did not know why he wanted her ring or what he intended to do with it. "Who are you?" she demanded. The cowboy looked at her directly, and she saw something in his eyes that gave her pause. Not pity exactly, but understanding. And something else beneath it, something she could not name. "Name is Ryder Ramsey, madam. I am a cattleman from Texas, just drove a herd up to the stockyards north of here. I have been on the trail for 3 months and have money to spend." "On a stranger's wedding ring." "On whatever I choose," Ryder said simply. $60 is a fair price for the gold, and if it helps a widow in need, then I consider it money well spent. Margaret stared at him, trying to understand his game. Men did not give away money, not in her experience. There was always an angle, always an expectation of something in return. "I do not need charity," she said stiffly. "I am not offering charity, I am making a purchase." Ryder counted out $60 onto the counter, the coins clinking against the wood. "There, the money is laid down. The ring is mine now, fairly bought and paid for." He slipped the ring into his vest pocket before Margaret could argue further. She looked at the money on the counter, then at Morrison, then back at Ryder Ramsey. "That is not how this works," she protested weakly. "That is exactly how it works," Morrison said gently. "The man made a higher offer before the sale was complete. The money is yours, Mrs. Davies. Take it." Margaret's pride warred with her need. $60 would keep her fed through the summer, would pay her debts with enough left over to buy supplies. It was more than she had hoped for. But accepting money from this strange cowboy felt like accepting something more, something she could not quite name and was not sure she wanted. Ryder Ramsey must have seen the conflict in her face. He stepped back, giving her space. "Madam, I will take my leave now. Morrison, I need to stock up on supplies for the trip back to Texas. I will be making camp outside town for a few days while I rest my horse and get ready for the return journey." He tipped his hat to Margaret and moved to the other side of the store, giving her privacy to collect the money. She watched him go, confused and unsettled. Morrison pushed the coins toward her. "Take it, Mrs. Davies. The Lord works in mysterious ways." Margaret scooped the money into her reticule, her hands shaking. She should feel relieved, she knew. The money would solve her immediate problems. But instead, she felt hollow, the absence of the ring on her finger more profound than ever. She left the trading post without another word to either man, stepping out into the bright Colorado sunshine. The street was busy with the usual afternoon activity. Miners coming and going, wagons rolling past, women with baskets heading to the general store. Silverton was a young town, rough around the edges, built on the promise of silver in the San Juan Mountains. The town had exploded in population after the Utes were forced out a year ago, opening the area to mining interests. Margaret had arrived with Thomas in the spring of 1879, when the town was barely more than a few rough buildings. Now it sprawled along the valley floor, new construction going up every week. She walked toward the general store, intending to pay down her debt, but her thoughts kept returning to the cowboy. Ryder Ramsey. What kind of man bought a widow's wedding ring? What would he do with it? Sell it in the next town for a profit. Give it to another woman. The thought made her stomach twist. Inside the general store, she paid $30 against her account, keeping the rest for food and supplies. The proprietor, Mr. Chen, a Chinese immigrant who had given up mining to open the store, thanked her gravely. He never pressed her for payment, never made her feel ashamed of her debt, and she appreciated his discretion. With her business concluded, Margaret bought flour, cornmeal, dried beans, bacon, and coffee. Mr. Chen threw in a small bag of sugar without charging her, and she thanked him with genuine warmth. These small kindnesses were what had kept her going through the dark winter months. The walk back to her cabin took her past the edge of town, where a small creek ran through a stand of cottonwood trees. It was a pretty spot, green and alive, a stark contrast to the bare slopes of the mountains rising all around. As she approached, she saw a familiar buckskin horse tied to one of the trees and a bedroll laid out in the shade. A small fire was already going, and a coffee pot sat on the rocks beside it. Ryder Ramsey stood by the creek, washing the trail dust from his face and hands. He looked up as she passed, water dripping from his dark hair. "Mrs. Davies," he called out. Margaret hesitated, then stopped. It would be rude to ignore him, and whatever else he might be, he had given her more money than the ring was worth. "Mr. Ramsey." He walked toward her, drying his hands on a cloth. Up close, in better light, she could see the lines around his eyes, the sun-weathered skin, the way he moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own body. "I wanted to apologize if I overstepped back in the trading post," he said. "It was not my place to interfere in your business. And yet you did." "Yes, madam, I did." He did not look apologetic, just matter of fact. "I saw a woman in need in a way I could help. I hope you will not hold it against me." "Why did you buy it?" Margaret asked directly. "What do you want with my wedding ring?" Ryder was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the mountains. "My mother sold her wedding ring after my father died," he finally said. "I was about 10 years old. She needed the money to keep food on the table for me and my 3 sisters. I never forgot the look on her face when she came home without it, like she had lost him all over again." The words hit Margaret square in the chest. She swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in her throat. "I am sorry for your loss," she managed. "It was a long time ago," Ryder said. "But I remember. And when I saw you standing there about to sell that ring, I saw my mother's face. I figured if I could do for you what no one did for her, maybe it would balance the scales a bit." "I do not understand what you mean." Ryder reached into his vest pocket and pulled out her ring. The gold gleamed in the late afternoon sun. He held it out to her. "I think this belongs on your finger, Mrs. Davies, not in some pawn shop or melted down for the gold." Margaret stared at the ring, then at him. "You paid $60 for it." "I did. And now you are just giving it back to me." "Yes, madam." "That makes no sense. You are losing $60. I am giving a widow back something that means more to her than money," Ryder corrected gently. "That seems like sense enough to me." Margaret's eyes filled with tears despite her best efforts to maintain her composure. She had cried so much in the past 6 months, she had thought herself empty of tears. But this unexpected kindness from a stranger broke something open inside her. "I cannot accept this," she whispered. "Why not?" "Because I needed that money. I still need it." "Taking the ring back without the money solves nothing." "You have the $60 I paid for it," Ryder pointed out. "The ring is just an added gift." "That is not how buying things works. You paid for the ring. It is yours now. And I am choosing to give it to you. Please, Mrs. Davies." "Take it." Margaret looked at the ring, her heart aching with longing to have it back on her finger where it belonged. But her practical mind, sharpened by months of hardship, could not accept something so illogical. "I do not even know you," she said. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" "Maybe because we are all strangers until we are not," Ryder said. "Maybe because kindness should not require familiarity. Or maybe I am just a fool with more money than sense." He smiled slightly. "My sisters would certainly agree with that assessment." Despite herself, Margaret felt the corners of her mouth twitch. "How many sisters did you say you have?" "3. All of them meaner than rattlesnakes and twice as opinionated. They run a ranch outside of Fort Worth now, married to good men who are probably regretting their life choices every single day." This time Margaret did smile, a small thing but real. Ryder's eyes warmed when he saw it. "There now," he said softly. "That is better. A woman as pretty as you should not have to carry such sadness." The compliment caught her off guard. She had not thought of herself as pretty in months, had barely looked in a mirror except to make sure her hair was pinned up properly. The unexpected praise made her flush. "That is forward, Mr. Ramsey. I apologize, but it is also true." He stepped closer, the ring still resting in his palm. "Please, let me do this one good thing. Take the ring." Margaret reached out slowly, her fingers trembling. She picked up the ring from his palm, the gold warm from his body heat. The familiar weight of it in her hand made her chest tighten. "I do not know what to say." "You do not have to say anything." Margaret slipped the ring back onto her finger, and the rightness of it there made tears spill down her cheeks. She wiped at them quickly, embarrassed to be crying in front of this stranger. "Thank you," she whispered. "I cannot explain what this means to me." "You do not have to explain." "I understand." They stood there in the shade of the cottonwoods, the creek babbling beside them, the late afternoon sun slanting through the leaves. Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a tiny crack in the wall she had built around her heart. "I should get home," she said, though she found herself reluctant to leave. "I have chickens to feed." "Of course. I did not mean to keep you." Margaret picked up her basket of supplies and started to walk away, then turned back. "Mr. Ramsey, will you truly be camping here for a few days?" "Yes, madam. My horse needs rest, and truth be told, so do I. 3 months on the trail takes it out of a man." "Then perhaps you would like a home-cooked meal tomorrow evening, as thanks for your kindness. It will not be fancy, but I can promise it will be better than trail food." Ryder's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Mrs. Davies, I would be honored. Thank you. My cabin is about a half-mile up the road, the one with the blue door. Come at sunset. I will be there." Margaret walked home with her heart feeling lighter than it had in months. She did not examine too closely why the thought of seeing Ryder Ramsey again pleased her so much. She told herself it was simple gratitude, nothing more. But the ring on her finger felt different now, like it carried new meaning alongside the old. That evening, as she fed her chickens and tended her garden, she caught herself humming a tune she had not sung since before Thomas died. The realization startled her, brought a wave of guilt. Was it wrong to feel happy, even for a moment? Was it a betrayal of Thomas's memory? But when she looked at the ring on her finger, she thought about what Ryder had said. His mother had sold her ring out of necessity, and Ryder had lived with that memory for 20 years. By giving Margaret her ring back, he had not been trying to replace her husband or diminish her grief. He had simply recognized her pain and chosen to ease it in the one way he could. That night, she pulled out her best dress from the trunk at the foot of her bed. It was a simple gray cotton with black trim, appropriate for a widow, but well-made and becoming. She had not worn it since the memorial service for Thomas and the other lost miners. She shook it out, checked for moth holes, and hung it up to air. The next day passed slowly. Margaret cleaned her small cabin until it shone, scrubbing the rough wooden floors and washing the windows. She picked fresh lettuce and radishes from her garden, gathered eggs from the chickens, and used some of her precious butter to make biscuits. She had splurged on a small piece of beef at the general store, and she prepared it with onions and potatoes, making a stew that filled the cabin with rich, savory smells. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, she changed into her gray dress and pinned up her hair with more care than usual. Her reflection in the small mirror above her wash basin showed a woman she barely recognized anymore. She had always been slender, but grief and hardship had whittled her down to almost gaunt. Her dark hair, once lustrous, had lost some of its shine. Her blue eyes, which Thomas had loved, looked too large in her thin face. But tonight, there was color in her cheeks and a brightness in her eyes that had been missing. She looked alive again, and the realization was both thrilling and terrifying. A knock at the door came precisely at sunset. Margaret smoothed her dress and opened it to find Ryder Ramsey standing on her small porch, hat in hand. He had cleaned up, his dark hair still damp, wearing a fresh shirt and clean pants. He looked handsome and uncertain, holding a small bunch of wildflowers picked from the meadow. "Mrs. Davies," he said, "these are for you. I know they are not much." "They are lovely," Margaret said, taking the flowers. "Purple lupines and yellow mountain sunflowers, the colors bright and cheerful. Please come in." Ryder ducked through the doorway, his height making her small cabin seem even smaller. He looked around, taking in the clean but sparse furnishings, the few personal touches that made it a home. A quilt on the bed that Margaret had made herself, curtains at the windows, a photograph of her and Thomas on their wedding day sitting on the mantel. "You have a nice home," he said. "It is small, but it is mine," Margaret replied. "Well, it will be mine if I can keep up with the payments to the landlord." She busied herself putting the flowers in a jar of water, then ladled stew into bowls. They sat at her small table, and Ryder removed his hat, bowing his head briefly in prayer before eating. Margaret had not prayed in months, but she found herself appreciating the gesture. "This is delicious," Ryder said after the first bite. "You were right, it is far better than trail food. I am glad you like it. It has been a long time since I cooked for anyone but myself." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the quiet broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls. As the meal progressed, they began to talk. Ryder told her about his cattle drive, the challenges of moving hundreds of head of cattle through difficult terrain, the men who worked for him, the satisfaction of delivering the herd successfully. "You own the cattle?" Margaret asked. "Some of them." "I have a ranch in partnership with my brother-in-law, James. We run about 500 head on our land, and we hire out to drive herds for other ranchers as well. It is good money, but hard work. Everything worthwhile is hard work, Margaret said. She told him about her garden, her chickens, her hopes of making enough to eventually buy her claim outright. She spoke about Thomas, haltingly at first, then with more ease as Ryder listened without judgment or empty platitudes. He was a dreamer, she said, always certain the next shaft would be the one to strike it rich. But he was also kind and hardworking. He did not deserve to die in that dark mountain. No one deserves that, Ryder agreed. I am sorry you lost him so young. I am sorry you lost your father, Margaret replied. And that your mother had to sell her ring. She made a good life for us despite it all, Ryder said. Worked as a seamstress, took in laundry, did whatever she had to do to keep us fed and clothed. She taught us that hard times do not define you, how you handle them does. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. She died 2 years ago, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. I think she was satisfied with the life she built. As darkness fell outside, Margaret lit 2 oil lamps, casting a warm glow over the cabin. She served the biscuits with butter and the last of her preserves, and they talked late into the evening. Ryder was easy to talk to, with a dry sense of humor and an honest way of speaking that Margaret appreciated. He did not try to impress her or fill the silence with empty words. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was thoughtful and genuine. When he finally stood to leave, Margaret felt a pang of disappointment. "Thank you for the meal," Ryder said. "It was truly wonderful." "Thank you for the company," Margaret replied. "It has been a long time since I have had a real conversation." At the door, Ryder paused. "Mrs. Davies, I know it is not my place to ask, but would you mind if I called on you again? I will be in town for a few more days, and I would enjoy the chance to talk with you more." Margaret knew she should say no. She was a widow in mourning, and propriety demanded she keep her distance from men, especially cowboys passing through town. But something about Ryder made her want to break those rules. "I would like that," she heard herself say. "Perhaps you could help me with some repairs around the cabin. The roof has a leak I cannot reach, and the chicken coop needs mending." Ryder's smile was warm and genuine. "I would be happy to help. I will come by tomorrow morning if that suits you." "That would be perfect." After he left, Margaret cleaned up the dishes, her mind whirling. She felt guilty for the happiness bubbling up inside her, as if enjoying Ryder's company somehow diminished what she had shared with Thomas. But she also felt alive in a way she had not since her husband's death. Was it wrong to want to feel that way? To want companionship and conversation and the warmth of another person's attention? She did not have answers, but when she went to bed that night, she slept better than she had in months. Ryder arrived the next morning as promised, carrying tools he had borrowed from the livery stable. He climbed onto the roof and patched the leak with fresh tar paper, then reinforced the chicken coop with new boards. Margaret worked in her garden while he labored, but they talked the whole time, conversations flowing easily from topic to topic. Over the next few days, Ryder became a regular presence at Margaret's cabin. He helped with heavy chores, chopped firewood for her winter stores, and fixed a dozen small things that had been beyond her ability to repair. In return, she cooked meals for him and mended his trail-worn clothes, her needle flying through fabric with practiced skill. The town began to notice. Mrs. Hernandez, who owned the boarding house, mentioned to Margaret at the general store that she had seen the cowboy coming and going from her cabin. Her tone was carefully neutral, but the implication was clear. Margaret felt her cheeks heat. "He is helping with repairs," she explained. "Nothing improper is happening." "I did not suggest otherwise," Mrs. Hernandez said mildly, "though a young widow must be careful of appearances." Margaret knew she was right, but she also knew that the repairs were genuine and necessary. And if she looked forward to Ryder's visits for reasons beyond the handyman services, well, that was her own business. On the fourth evening, after they had shared another meal, Ryder did not immediately move to leave. They sat on the porch of her cabin, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The mountains rose around them, dark shapes against the purple twilight. "I should be heading back to Texas soon," Ryder said quietly. "My partner will be wondering where I am." Margaret's heart sank. "Of course. You have a ranch to run, but I find myself reluctant to leave Silverton." "The scenery is beautiful," Margaret said carefully. "That is not what I meant, and I think you know it." Margaret was quiet, her pulse quickening. "Mrs. Davies, Margaret, if I may be so bold, these past few days have meant more to me than I know how to express. Your company, your conversation, your kindness. I came to this town a stranger, and you welcomed me with generosity I did not deserve. You gave me back my wedding ring. I think that deserves considerable generosity in return." "I did not do it expecting anything in return," Ryder said. "I did it because it was right, but I am grateful it led to knowing you." Margaret looked at the ring on her finger, gleaming in the fading light. "I am grateful too. You have helped me remember that there is goodness in the world, even after loss." "Will you write to me?" Ryder asked. "When I return to Texas, I would very much like to continue our friendship through letters." "I would like that," Margaret said. She hesitated, then added, "Though I should tell you my ability to write regularly may be limited. I will need to find work to support myself, and that will take most of my time." "What kind of work are you seeking?" "Whatever I can find. Laundry, sewing, cleaning. Perhaps cooking for the boarding house or one of the hotels." Ryder was quiet for a long moment. "May I ask you something? And please do not take offense, as none is meant." "Of course. Have you considered leaving Silverton, going somewhere with more opportunities?" Margaret had considered it many times, but the thought of leaving the place where she and Thomas had built their life together, where he was buried in the small cemetery on the hillside, felt like abandonment. "This is my home," she said simply. "I do not have anywhere else to go." "You could go to Texas." The words hung in the air between them. Margaret's breath caught. "Mr. Ramsey, I do not understand what you are suggesting." Ryder turned to face her, his expression serious in the dim light. "I am suggesting that you do not have to face the future alone. I know it is fast, and I know I have no right to ask this of you, but I have not felt this way about anyone in a very long time, maybe ever. You are strong and brave and kind. You deserve a life that is not just about survival. Are you asking me to come to Texas as your wife?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am asking you to consider it. Not right now, not this moment, but to think about it. We could write to each other, get to know each other better through letters. And if, in time, you thought you might be able to care for me the way I am beginning to care for you, then yes, I would be honored beyond measure if you would consent to be my wife." Margaret stood abruptly, moving to the porch railing. Her hands gripped the rough wood as she tried to process what he was saying. It was too fast, too much. She had known him less than a week, and yet her heart was pounding not with fear or shock, but with something that felt dangerously like hope. "I cannot," she said. "It is too soon. Thomas has only been gone 6 months. I know, and I respect that. I'm not asking you to forget him or to stop grieving. I am only asking you to consider that there might be room in your future for happiness again. You barely know me." "I know enough to know I want to know more," Ryder said. He came to stand beside her, close but not touching. "I know you are brave enough to face hardship without complaint. I know you are kind enough to invite a stranger to dinner. I know you loved your husband deeply and honor his memory. I know you make the best biscuits I have ever tasted, and your laugh, the few times I have heard it, is like music. I know that when I am with you, I feel more myself than I have in years." Tears streamed down Margaret's face. "This is madness. You live in Texas. I live in Colorado. We are practically strangers. Then let us remedy that. Let us write to each other. Let us take our time and see where it leads. I am not asking you to make a decision tonight. I am only asking you not to close the door on the possibility." Margaret turned to look at him, this cowboy who had walked into her life and turned everything upside down. In the starlight, his eyes were dark and earnest, his expression open and hopeful. She thought of the long, lonely months ahead, the struggle to survive, the endless grief. And she thought of the possibility of something different, something more. "I will write to you," she said finally, "but I make no promises beyond that. That is all I ask." Ryder reached out slowly, giving her time to step away if she wished. When she did not move, he took her hand, the one wearing the ring he had given back to her. His thumb brushed over the gold band. "This ring belonged with you," he said softly. "And I think maybe I belong with you too, but we have time to figure that out." The next morning, Ryder prepared to leave Silverton. Margaret walked with him to where his horse was saddled and ready for the long journey back to Texas. He had given her his address, and she had promised to write within the week. "Travel safely," she said, her throat tight. "I will. And I will write as soon as I reach home." Ryder mounted his horse, looking down at her. "Thank you, Margaret, for everything. Thank you for giving me back more than just my ring." He smiled, tipped his hat, and rode away. Margaret watched until he disappeared around the bend in the road, then walked slowly back to her cabin. The place felt emptier than it had before, but not in a sad way. It felt like a space waiting to be filled with something new. That evening, she sat at her small table with paper and ink and began a letter. She told Ryder about her day, about the small victories in her garden, about the weather and the town news. She told him things she had not shared with anyone, thoughts and fears and hopes she had kept locked inside. The words flowed easily, and when she finally sealed the letter and addressed it to Fort Worth, Texas, she felt lighter. Over the next months, letters flew back and forth between Colorado and Texas. Ryder wrote about his ranch, his work, his family. His sisters, he reported, were intensely curious about the widow he had mentioned in his letters and were already planning what they would wear to a wedding. Margaret wrote back that he was getting ahead of himself, but she could not help smiling as she wrote it. As summer turned to fall, Margaret found work helping the doctor's wife with housekeeping and cooking. The money was not much, but combined with what she made selling eggs and vegetables, it was enough to keep her going. She thought often of Ryder's offer to come to Texas, but she was not ready. Not yet. In his letters, Ryder was patient and understanding. He never pressed her for a decision, never made her feel guilty for taking her time. He simply shared his life with her through words on paper, and slowly, Margaret found her grief transforming into something softer. She would always love Thomas, always carry him in her heart. But the raw, overwhelming pain began to ease, making room for other emotions. By winter, Margaret realized she was falling in love with Ryder Ramsey. It was different from what she had felt for Thomas, less the passionate rush of young love and more a steady, deep current of respect and affection. She loved the way Ryder thought, the values he held, the kindness he showed to everyone in his life. She loved his dry humor and his honesty. She loved that he had given her time to grieve without rushing her into anything. In January of 1882, 8 months after Ryder had ridden out of Silverton, Margaret received a letter that made her heart race. Ryder wrote that he would be making another cattle drive north in the spring, and he hoped to stop in Silverton on his way. He wanted to see her again, to talk face to face about their future. Margaret wrote back immediately, her answer filling 3 pages. She told him she would be waiting, and that she thought it was time they had that conversation. When April arrived, and the snow began to melt in the high country, Margaret found herself watching the road constantly. Ryder had written that he would arrive around mid-month, but trail drives were unpredictable. He could be early or late depending on weather and a dozen other factors. She was working in her garden on a bright afternoon when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. She looked up to see Ryder riding toward her cabin, the sight of him making her heart leap. She stood, brushing dirt from her hands, suddenly nervous. Ryder dismounted and walked toward her, and Margaret met him halfway. For a moment they just stood there, looking at each other, months of letters made flesh. "Hello, Margaret," Ryder said softly. "Hello, Ryder. You look beautiful. You are a terrible liar. I am covered in garden dirt. Then you are beautiful covered in garden dirt." He stepped closer. "I have missed you. Letters are wonderful, but they are a poor substitute for seeing you, hearing your voice." "I have missed you too," Margaret admitted, "more than I thought possible. I have been thinking about what to say to you during the entire ride north," Ryder said. "I planned out whole speeches, practiced them on my horse who was singularly unimpressed. But now that I am here, all those words seem inadequate." "Then perhaps we do not need speeches," Margaret said. "Perhaps we just need honesty." "All right then. Honestly, I love you, Margaret Davies. I have loved you since the moment I saw you standing in that trading post, trying to be brave while your heart was breaking. I love your strength and your kindness and your courage. I love the way you think and the way you laugh, and the way you honor those you have lost while still having room in your heart for new things. I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy, if you will let me." Margaret felt tears welling up, but this time they were not tears of grief. "I love you too," she whispered. "I did not think I could feel this way again, but you have shown me that the heart has more capacity than I knew. I will never forget Thomas, but I am ready to build a new life. With you." Ryder's face broke into a wide smile. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and Margaret let herself sink into his embrace. He smelled of leather and sage and the open trail, and she felt safe in a way she had not felt since before Thomas died. "Will you marry me?" Ryder asked. "Will you come to Texas and be my wife?" "Yes," Margaret said. "Yes to all of it." Ryder pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes bright. "You mean it, I mean it, though I have conditions." "Name them." "I want to take some of Thomas's things with me, his photographs, some of his tools. I do not want to erase him from my life." "Of course, I would never ask you to do that. And I want to visit his grave before we leave to say goodbye properly. We will do it together if you want company." Margaret nodded, emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "And one more thing. I want to get married here in Silverton before we leave. I want to start our new life properly as husband and wife." "Then we will find a preacher and do it right," Ryder agreed. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "May I kiss you, Margaret?" She had not been kissed since Thomas died, had not imagined wanting anyone else's lips on hers. But she wanted this, wanted Ryder, wanted to seal their promises with this simple intimacy. "Yes," she breathed. Ryder kissed her gently, reverently, as if she were something precious and fragile. Margaret kissed him back, letting herself feel the spark of attraction, the warmth of connection. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. "I am going to do my best to make you happy," Ryder said. "You already have," Margaret replied. They were married 3 days later in the small church in Silverton. Mrs. Hernandez and the doctor's wife stood as witnesses, and the preacher who had conducted Thomas's memorial service performed the ceremony. Margaret wore a new dress, pale blue instead of black, that Mrs. Hernandez had helped her sew. Ryder wore his best clothes and could not stop smiling. When the preacher asked if they had rings, Ryder surprised Margaret by pulling out 2 gold bands. One was her wedding ring from Thomas, which she still wore. The other was a new ring, simple but beautiful. "I thought you might want to wear both," Ryder said quietly. "The old and the new together." Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Ryder slipped the new ring onto her finger beside the old one, and she placed a band on his finger in return. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Ryder kissed her in front of the small gathering, Margaret felt Thomas's blessing like a warm presence. He had loved her, and he would want her to be happy. This was not betrayal. This was moving forward while honoring the past. They spent their wedding night at the boarding house, in the nicest room Mrs. Hernandez had available. Ryder was patient and gentle, understanding that intimacy would take time for Margaret. They talked late into the night, making plans for their future, and when they finally made love, it was tender and sweet and filled with promise. The next morning, they visited the cemetery together. Margaret knelt by the simple wooden marker that bore Thomas's name, Ryder standing respectfully behind her. "I will always love you," she said softly to Thomas. "Thank you for the years we had together, for the dreams we shared. I hope you understand that I have to keep living, keep moving forward. Ryder is a good man, and I think you would approve. Watch over us if you can, and know that you will always be part of my story." She placed a bouquet of wildflowers on the grave, then stood. Ryder took her hand, and together they walked back down the hillside. Over the next week, they prepared for the journey to Texas. Margaret sold what she could not take with her, gave away her chickens to neighbors who had been kind, and packed her few precious possessions. The photograph of her and Thomas went carefully into her trunk, along with his pocket watch and the quilt she had made. She was taking her past with her into her future, and it felt right. The trip to Texas was long but filled with wonder. Ryder showed her the wide open spaces of his homeland, the endless sky, the wild beauty of the frontier. They traveled with the cattle drive, Margaret riding beside Ryder during the day and sleeping under the stars at night. The cowboys were respectful and friendly, clearly pleased that their boss had found happiness. When they finally reached the ranch outside Fort Worth, Margaret was exhausted but exhilarated. The ranch was larger than she had imagined, with a sturdy house, barns, corrals, and pastures stretching as far as she could see. Ryder's 3 sisters descended on them immediately, all talking at once, hugging Margaret and welcoming her to the family with overwhelming enthusiasm. Sarah was the oldest, married to James, who co-owned the ranch with Ryder. She was bossy and efficient and clearly ran her household with an iron will. Emma was the middle sister, married to a cattle buyer named Robert, and she was gentle and soft-spoken. The youngest, Rachel, was married to a horse trainer named Daniel, and she had her brother's dry sense of humor and direct manner. "You must be something special," Rachel said to Margaret after dinner that first night. "Ryder has never brought a woman home before." "We were beginning to think he was married to his cattle." "I am just a widow from Colorado," Margaret said. "You are not just anything," Sarah corrected firmly. "Any woman who can make our brother smile the way he has been smiling is extraordinary." Margaret settled into her new life with surprising ease. The ranch was busy, always something to do, but she found she enjoyed the work. She helped with cooking and preserving, learned to manage the household accounts, and gradually became friends with Ryder's sisters. They were opinionated and sometimes overwhelming, but they were also kind and welcoming, treating her like family from the start. Ryder was everything a husband should be. He was attentive without being smothering, affectionate without being demanding. He respected her need for space when grief over Thomas hit her unexpectedly, and he celebrated with her when she had good days. He worked hard, but he always made time for her, whether it was riding out to check the fences together or sitting on the porch in the evening talking about their days. As the months passed, Margaret found herself fully integrating into her new life. She made friends in Fort Worth, became involved in the community, and discovered talents she had not known she possessed. She was good with numbers, and she began helping Ryder with the ranch bookkeeping. She had an eye for horses, and she started working with Daniel, learning about breeding and training. A year after arriving in Texas, Margaret realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. She had wanted children with Thomas, but they had not been blessed before his death. Now, carrying Ryder's child, she felt the full weight of her new life. When she told Ryder, he picked her up and spun her around, whooping with joy. His sisters were equally thrilled, already planning the baby's arrival with military precision. The pregnancy was not easy. Margaret was sick for the first few months, and the Texas heat in summer was brutal. But Ryder was attentive and worried, bringing her cool drinks and making sure she rested. His sisters visited regularly, sharing advice and stories from their own pregnancies. In March of 1883, Margaret gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Thomas Ryder Ramsey, honoring both the husband she had lost and the husband she had found. Holding her son, with Ryder beside her looking down at them both with wonder and love, Margaret felt her life had come full circle. Thomas would have wanted her to be happy, to have children, to build a life filled with love and purpose. And she had done that, not by forgetting him, but by having the courage to love again. Over the next years, Margaret and Ryder built a rich, full life together. They had 2 more children, a daughter they named Mary Rose, and another son named Robert Daniel. The ranch prospered under their combined management, growing from a few hundred head of cattle to over 1,000. They built a larger house, with room for their growing family and for the extended visits from Ryder's sisters and their children. Margaret never forgot Thomas. His photograph held a place of honor in their home, and she told their children about the brave miner who had been her first love. But she also knew that the best way to honor his memory was to live fully, to embrace the second chance she had been given. Ryder remained her rock, her partner, her love. He never grew jealous of her memories of Thomas, understanding that her capacity to love was vast enough to hold them both. He was a wonderful father, patient and playful, teaching their children to ride and work and love the land. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Ryder gave Margaret a new ring to add to the 2 she wore. This one had a small diamond, a luxury they could now afford thanks to the ranch's success. "One ring for the past, one for the day we married, and one for the future we are building," he said as he slipped it onto her finger. Margaret looked at the 3 rings, each one telling part of her story. The first spoke of young love and dreams cut short. The second spoke of courage and second chances. The third spoke of prosperity and peace hard won. "They are perfect," she said, "just like this life we have built." "The life you let me build with you," Ryder corrected. "I will never forget that you took a chance on a cowboy who bought your wedding ring in a trading post. And I will never forget that you gave it back to me," Margaret said. "You gave me back more than a ring that day. You gave me back hope." They stood on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of orange and gold. Their children played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. In the distance, cattle grazed on their land, and the ranch hands were heading in for supper. Margaret thought back to that desperate day in Silverton, when she had walked into the trading post to sell the last thing of value she owned. She had been so lost, so certain that her life was effectively over. She could never have imagined the journey that would follow, the love she would find, the family she would build. Sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected places. A cowboy passing through town, a simple act of kindness, a wedding ring bought and returned. These small moments had changed the entire trajectory of her life, had opened doors she thought were permanently closed. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Ryder pulled Margaret close, and she leaned into his embrace, grateful beyond measure for the life they shared. She had learned that the heart was more resilient than she ever knew, that grief and joy could coexist, that honoring the past and embracing the future were not mutually exclusive. The rings on her finger caught the last light of day, 3 bands of gold telling her story. Loss and love, ending and beginning, the woman she had been and the woman she had become. Together they made her whole. And in that moment, surrounded by the family she had created with Ryder, standing on land they had built their dreams upon, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The journey had been hard, the path uncertain, but every step had led her here, to this perfect, precious life. The years continued to pass in a rhythm of seasons and celebrations. Margaret watched her children grow, each developing their own personalities and dreams. Thomas, their eldest, proved to have his namesake's adventurous spirit, though tempered with Ryder's practical wisdom. At 10 years old, he was already showing interest in the ranch operations, following his father everywhere and asking endless questions about cattle and horses. Mary Rose, 8 years old, was gentle like her Uncle Robert's wife Emma, but with a stubborn streak that reminded everyone of Sarah. She loved to help Margaret in the kitchen and had already mastered several recipes, taking pride in feeding the ranch hands. Robert Daniel, the youngest at 6, was pure mischief and joy. He had his father's humor and his mother's kindness, and he charmed everyone he met. He was the ranch's official greeter, running to welcome visitors and making fast friends with everyone who crossed their threshold. Margaret's relationship with Ryder only deepened with time. They had weathered challenges together, from droughts that threatened their cattle to a particularly harsh winter that had tested everyone's endurance. Through it all, they remained partners in the truest sense, making decisions together, supporting each other, building something lasting. One evening in the summer of 1888, as they sat on their porch watching fireflies dance in the warm air, Ryder took Margaret's hand. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Leaving Colorado, leaving the life you had planned with Thomas." Margaret considered the question seriously, as she always did with Ryder. "I regret that Thomas died so young that we did not get to grow old together as we planned. I regret the hardship and the grief. But regret coming here, marrying you, building this life? Never. Even though it was so fast, even though you barely knew me, especially because of that," Margaret said. "You taught me that sometimes you have to take a leap of faith, that the safe choice is not always the right choice. If I had stayed in Colorado, I would have survived. But here, with you, I have thrived." Ryder brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles just above the 3 rings. "I think about that day in the trading post sometimes. What would have happened if I had not walked in at that exact moment? If I had been 5 minutes later or had chosen to go somewhere else? We never would have met," Margaret said. "I would have sold the ring to Mr. Morrison, used the money to get by, and probably would have eventually married someone else out of necessity rather than love. And I would have driven my cattle north and gone back to Texas without ever knowing what I was missing." They sat in comfortable silence, hands entwined, watching the stars emerge one by one. After a while, Margaret spoke again. "You know what I think about? I think about your mother, about how she sold her ring out of desperation, and how that memory stayed with you for 20 years. In a way, her sacrifice led to our happiness. If she had not done that, if you had not witnessed it, you might not have understood why I was selling mine. You might have walked right past me in that trading post. I had never thought of it that way, Ryder said slowly. You are right. Everything that happened to us, both the good and the bad, led to this moment, which is why I do not regret any of it. Even the pain had purpose. The sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider was approaching the ranch, moving fast. Ryder stood, his hand instinctively going to the gun belt he always wore. Violence was less common now than it had been in the early days of settlement, but caution was still necessary. The rider proved to be young Billy Chen, the son of the man who had run the general store in Silverton. He pulled his horse to a stop in front of the porch, breathing hard. "Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey," he gasped. "I apologize for the late visit, but I have urgent news." "What is it, Billy?" "What are you doing so far from Silverton?" Margaret asked, concerned. The Chens had been kind to her during her time as a widow, and she had kept up correspondence with them over the years. "My father is expanding the business. He sent me to Texas to scout potential trade routes and make connections, but that is not why I am here tonight." Billy pulled a letter from his saddlebag. "This came to our store a few weeks ago, addressed to you, Mrs. Ramsey. It was forwarded from the old boarding house in Silverton. Mrs. Hernandez sent it on to us, thinking we might know your whereabouts. When I realized I would be coming to Texas, I offered to deliver it personally." Margaret took the letter, studying the unfamiliar handwriting on the envelope. "Thank you, Billy. Have you eaten?" "We have plenty of food, and you are welcome to stay the night before continuing your journey." "I would be grateful for that, madam." While Ryder took Billy inside and called for Mary Rose to prepare a plate of food, Margaret opened the letter. The paper was expensive, the handwriting educated. She read it quickly, then read it again more slowly, her heart beginning to pound. When Ryder returned, he found her still standing on the porch, the letter clutched in her hand. "What is it?" "Bad news." "No," Margaret said slowly. "Not bad news, just unexpected news." She handed him the letter. "It is from a lawyer in Denver." Ryder read aloud. "Dear Mrs. Davies, I am writing to inform you of a matter concerning the estate of your late husband, Thomas Davies. The mining company that owned the shaft where Mr. Davies died has been sold to new ownership. During the transfer of assets and review of records, it was discovered that the company had been negligent in their safety measures, contributing to the collapse that killed your husband and the other miners. A settlement has been reached with the families of all the deceased miners. As Mr. Davies's widow, you are entitled to compensation in the amount of $500. Please contact this office at your earliest convenience to make arrangements for receiving these funds." Ryder looked up from the letter, his eyes wide. $500. "Margaret, that is a fortune." "Blood money," Margaret said quietly. "Payment for taking my husband from me. It will not bring him back, but it is acknowledgement that his death could have been prevented. That means something." Margaret took the letter back, folding it carefully. "I know what I want to do with it. I want to start a fund to help widows in Texas. Women like I was, left alone without means. We could use the money to provide small loans or grants, help them get back on their feet." Ryder smiled, pulling her into his arms. "You have the biggest heart of anyone I have ever known. Thomas would be proud of you." "I hope so. He was always generous, always wanting to help others. This seems like a fitting way to honor his memory." Over the next months, Margaret worked with a lawyer in Fort Worth to establish the Davies Widows Fund. The $500 from the settlement became the seed money for something that would eventually help dozens of women. Margaret served as the fund's administrator, reviewing applications and making decisions about distributions. She visited with the widows personally when she could, offering not just financial assistance but also advice, encouragement, and friendship. The fund became one of her greatest sources of satisfaction. She met women from all walks of life, each with their own story of loss and struggle. Some were young, like she had been. Others were older, facing the challenge of supporting themselves after decades of marriage. Some had children, others were alone, but all of them needed help, and Margaret was able to provide it. Ryder supported her work completely, even as it took more and more of her time. He was proud of what she was building, proud of how she had turned her own painful experience into something that blessed others. One of the women Margaret helped was a young widow named Clara, whose husband had died in a farming accident, leaving her with 3 small children. Margaret provided her with a grant to buy a milk cow and some chickens, giving her a way to support her family. A year later, Clara had built up a small dairy business and was thriving. She wrote to Margaret regularly, and the two women developed a friendship that lasted for years. As the 1880s drew to a close, Margaret looked back on the decade with amazement. She had gone from a desperate widow selling her wedding ring to survive, to a prosperous rancher's wife with 3 healthy children and a mission to help others. The transformation seemed almost impossible, and yet it had happened one day at a time, one choice at a time. In 1890, Margaret received another letter from Colorado, this time from Mrs. Hernandez. The boarding house owner wrote that she was getting older and thinking of retiring. She wanted to sell the boarding house, and she wondered if Margaret might know anyone interested in purchasing it and continuing the business. Margaret showed the letter to Ryder that evening. "What do you think?" she asked. "Should we buy it? We could afford it," Ryder said thoughtfully. "The ranch is doing well, and we have savings put aside. But why would we want a boarding house in Colorado? We could use it as an extension of the widow's fund. Provide affordable housing for women who need a fresh start. Mrs. Hernandez has always been kind to those in need. We could continue that tradition." Ryder considered this. It would mean traveling to Colorado to set it up properly, making sure we had good management in place. "We could make it a family trip," Margaret suggested. "The children have never seen Colorado. I could show them where I lived with Thomas, where you and I met. And visit his grave," Ryder added softly. "Yes, I think it is time." They made the trip that summer, the whole family traveling by train from Fort Worth to Silverton. The children were fascinated by everything, their excitement infectious. When they finally arrived in Silverton, Margaret was struck by how much the town had changed. Where there had been rough wooden buildings, there were now substantial brick structures. The population had grown significantly, and the town had a more settled, permanent feel. Mrs. Hernandez met them at the boarding house, older and grayer but still sharp-eyed and efficient. She welcomed them warmly, exclaiming over the children and insisting they stay with her during their visit. Over the next week, Margaret showed her family around the town that had been her home during the hardest time of her life. She took them to the trading post where she had met Ryder, to the church where they had married, to the small cabin she had lived in as a widow. The cabin was abandoned now, the blue door faded and hanging crooked on its hinges. They walked through the rooms, Margaret pointing out where things had been, telling stories of that difficult year. "You were brave, Mama," Thomas said, looking around the tiny space. "Living here all alone." "I did not feel brave," Margaret admitted. "I felt scared and sad and lost, but sometimes bravery is just doing what you have to do to survive." On their last day in Silverton, the family climbed the hillside to the cemetery. Margaret had brought flowers from Mrs. Hernandez's garden, bright blooms that added color to the somber place. Thomas Davies's marker was weathered now, the wood graying but still legible. Margaret knelt beside the grave, her children gathering around her. Ryder stood back, giving her space for this private moment. "Thomas, I have brought my family to meet you," Margaret said softly. "This is Thomas, named for you, and Mary Rose and Robert Daniel. They are good children, and I think you would have loved them." She paused, emotion thick in her throat. "I have built a good life, the life we dreamed of having together. I wish you could have been part of it, but I know you would be happy that I am happy. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for the time we had. I will never forget you." She placed the flowers on the grave, then stood. Young Thomas stepped forward, his young face serious. "Thank you for taking care of my mama when she needed it," he said to the grave. "I will take care of her now when I am grown." Margaret pulled her son into a hug, tears streaming down her face. Mary Rose and Robert Daniel added their own flowers to the grave, solemn in the presence of death and memory. When they walked back down the hillside, Margaret felt lighter. She had said her goodbyes properly, had introduced her two lives to each other. Thomas Davies and Ryder Ramsey, the two men she had loved, the two men who had shaped her life. There was no conflict between them, no competition. Both had given her what she needed when she needed it. The purchase of the boarding house was completed before they left Silverton. Margaret hired a local woman to manage it, with strict instructions to offer fair rates and to provide a safe haven for women in need. A portion of the Davies Widows Fund would support the boarding house, ensuring it remained affordable. The train ride back to Texas was filled with chatter as the children processed everything they had seen and learned. Margaret sat beside Ryder, their hands clasped together, watching the landscape roll past. "Thank you for understanding why I needed to do this," she said quietly. "You do not have to thank me. Thomas was part of your life, an important part. Our children should know their full history. You are a remarkable man, Ryder Ramsey. I am just a cowboy who got lucky enough to buy a wedding ring at the right time." Margaret laughed, leaning her head on his shoulder. "You are so much more than that." The years continued to pass in a rich tapestry of ordinary moments and extraordinary blessings. Margaret's children grew into capable, kind adults. Thomas took over more responsibility at the ranch, proving to be a natural cattleman with his father's business sense and his namesake's adventurous spirit. Mary Rose married a schoolteacher and moved to Fort Worth, where she taught music and raised 3 children of her own. Robert Daniel surprised everyone by becoming a lawyer, using his charm and intelligence to build a successful practice defending the rights of small ranchers against larger interests. Margaret and Ryder became grandparents, a role they both embraced with joy. Their home was always full of family, children and grandchildren coming and going in a constant stream of activity and laughter. The Davies Widows Fund continued to grow, helping hundreds of women over the years. Margaret poured her heart into the work, finding deep satisfaction in making a difference in people's lives. She often thought of how her own life had been changed by one act of kindness from a stranger, and she tried to pay that forward in every way she could. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1902, Ryder arranged a special celebration. He had invited their children and grandchildren, Ryder's sisters and their families, and many of the friends they had made over the years. The ranch house was decorated with flowers and ribbons, and tables groaned under the weight of food. As the sun set and the party continued, Ryder pulled Margaret aside to the porch where they had spent so many evenings together. "I have something for you," he said, pulling a small box from his pocket. "Ryder, you have already given me everything I could ever want. Just open it." Inside the box was a 4th ring, this one inscribed on the inside with words Margaret had to tilt toward the lamplight to read. Love is patient. Love is kind. One ring for each chapter of your life, Ryder said. The first for your youth and first love. The second for the day we married and started our life together. The third for our prosperity and success. And this one for the future, for growing old together, for patience and kindness and enduring love. Margaret slipped the ring onto her finger alongside the others, 4 bands of gold circling her finger like chapters in a book. They are perfect, she whispered. You are perfect. Far from perfect, but I have tried to be worthy of you. You have succeeded beyond measure. They kissed as the sun set over their land, surrounded by the sounds of family and celebration, wrapped in the golden light of a Texas evening. 20 years of marriage, 20 years of building a life together, and Margaret loved Ryder more with each passing day. As they rejoined the party, Margaret caught sight of the photograph of Thomas Davies that still hung in their front room. For just a moment, she could have sworn she saw a smile on his face in the fading light, a blessing from beyond the grave. She smiled back, her heart full of gratitude for all the love she had been given, both past and present. The party continued late into the night, with music and dancing and storytelling. The grandchildren fell asleep in various corners, worn out from play. The adults lingered over coffee and dessert, sharing memories and making new ones. Sarah, now in her 60s but still formidable, stood to give a toast. To my brother Ryder and his wife Margaret. 20 years ago, Ryder came home from a cattle drive with stars in his eyes and a story about a widow in Colorado. We thought he had lost his mind, rushing into marriage with a woman he barely knew. But as usual, Ryder proved us all wrong. Margaret, you have been a blessing to this family and to everyone who knows you. You have taught us about strength and kindness, about honoring the past while embracing the future. To Margaret and Ryder, may you have 20 more years together and 20 beyond that. Everyone raised their glasses, voices joining in agreement. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelmed by the love in the room. This was her family, her tribe, her people. They had welcomed her without reservation, made her one of their own, and supported her through every challenge. As the celebration finally wound down and guests began to head home or to guest rooms, Margaret and Ryder found themselves alone on the porch once more. It had become their sacred space, the place where they talked through problems, celebrated victories, and simply enjoyed each other's company. Can you believe it has been 20 years? Margaret asked. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Other times it feels like you have always been part of my life. I know what you mean. I can barely remember what life was like before you. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had not bought that ring? If I had just let you sell it and walked away? Margaret had wondered this many times over the years. I think I would have survived. I was strong enough to endure, but I would have missed out on all of this. The love, the family, the joy. I would have had a life, but not this life. I would have gone back to Texas and probably eventually married someone else out of duty rather than love. I would have had a fine life, I suppose. But I would have always felt like something was missing, even if I could not name what it was. We were both lucky, Margaret said. We were both blessed, Ryder corrected. Luck is random chance. Blessings are gifts from God. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from years of companionship. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on velvet. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled and cattle lowed in response. You have any regrets? Ryder asked. Anything you wish you had done differently? Margaret considered the question seriously. I wish I had been brave enough to tell you I was falling in love with you sooner, instead of making you wait through months of letters. But then again, maybe that time was necessary. Maybe I needed those months to process my grief and come to terms with loving again. I would have waited years if necessary, Ryder said. You were worth waiting for. What about you? Any regrets? Only that I did not walk into that trading post 5 minutes earlier. Then maybe you would not have had to even consider selling the ring in the first place. But then we might not have had a reason to talk, Margaret pointed out. The ring was the connection between us, the thing that made you notice me. Without it, you might have just bought your supplies and left. True. So perhaps everything happened exactly as it was meant to. Margaret looked at the 4 rings on her finger, each one catching the starlight. I believe that. I believe that all of it, the good and the bad, the joy and the sorrow, led to this moment, and I would not change any of it. They sat together until late in the night, talking about the past and planning for the future. They discussed which of their grandchildren might be interested in taking over the ranch eventually, how to expand the widow's fund to help even more women, whether they should build a new barn before winter. These were the conversations of a life well lived, of partners who had built something lasting together. They spoke with the ease of long familiarity, finishing each other's sentences, reading each other's moods, existing in perfect harmony. As the moon rose high overhead, they finally went inside to bed. In their room, Margaret carefully removed her 4 rings and placed them in the small wooden box Ryder had made for them years ago. Each night she took them off, and each morning she put them back on, a ritual that connected her to all the chapters of her life. Ryder wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close against him. Even after 20 years, the comfort of his embrace still made her feel safe and cherished. I love you, Margaret Ramsey, he whispered into her hair. I love you too, Ryder, with all my heart. They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, the way they had slept every night for 20 years, the way they would sleep for many years to come. The years passed, bringing new challenges and new joys. The ranch continued to prosper under the combined management of Ryder and their son Thomas. The widow's fund grew beyond anything Margaret had initially imagined, helping women across Texas and even expanding to Colorado. Margaret and Ryder grew older together, their hair turning gray, lines deepening on their faces, but their love only strengthening with time. They celebrated 25 years of marriage, then 30. They became great-grandparents, marveling at the new generation of their family. They weathered economic downturns and droughts, supported their children through their own challenges, and continued to build a legacy of love and service. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1922, they gathered their entire family together for one final great celebration. Margaret was 64 years old, Ryder 68, both still active and engaged with life but aware of time's passage. Their son Thomas, now 40, stood to give a toast. My parents taught me many things. They taught me about hard work and integrity, about kindness and generosity. But most importantly, they taught me about love. Real love, the kind that endures through hardship and triumph, the kind that makes 2 people into one while still honoring who they are as individuals. Mom, Dad, thank you for showing us what a marriage should look like. Mary Rose added her own toast, speaking of her mother's strength and her father's gentleness. Robert Daniel told stories that made everyone laugh and cry. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren shared their own memories and thanks. Finally, Ryder stood, pulling Margaret to her feet beside him. 40 years ago, I walked into a trading post in Silverton, Colorado, and saw a woman trying to sell her wedding ring. I did not know her name, did not know her story, but something told me I needed to buy that ring and give it back to her. Best $60 I ever spent. The room erupted in laughter. Margaret squeezed his hand, smiling through tears. What I did not know then, Ryder continued, was that I was not just buying a ring. I was buying a future. I was taking the first step toward the greatest adventure of my life. Margaret, you have made me happier than I ever imagined possible. You have given me children and grandchildren, a home and a purpose. You have made me a better man. I thank God every day for leading me into that trading post at exactly the right moment. And I thank God for a cowboy brave enough to give a widow back her wedding ring, Margaret said. You gave me back more than a ring that day, Ryder. You gave me back my life. You gave me hope when I had none, love when I thought I would never love again, and a future beyond anything I had dreamed. These 40 years have been the greatest blessing of my life. They kissed as their family cheered, a kiss that held 40 years of love and commitment, of partnership and friendship, of passion and companionship. That night, after all the guests had left and they were alone in their room, Margaret took off her 4 rings and held them in her palm. The gold had worn thin in places, the bands smooth from decades of wearing. Each ring told a story, and together they told the story of her life. Do you know what I realized today? She said to Ryder. These rings are not about the past anymore. They are about the present. The first ring reminds me that I am capable of great love. The second reminds me that I am brave enough to take risks. The third reminds me that hard work brings rewards. And the fourth reminds me that the best things in life are patient and kind. That is beautiful, Ryder said, though I still like my version where they represent chapters of your life. They can be both, Margaret said. She slipped the rings back onto her finger where they belonged. That is the wonderful thing about symbols. They mean whatever we need them to mean. They lived several more good years, watching their family continue to grow and thrive. The ranch passed to the next generation, the widow's fund continued its work, and their love story became family legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren. When Ryder passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 75 in 1929, Margaret mourned him deeply. But she did not fall apart the way she had when Thomas died. She was stronger now, shaped by decades of living and loving. She knew how to carry grief while still finding joy in each day. She continued to live at the ranch, surrounded by family, active in the widow's fund, dispensing wisdom and love to all who sought it. She added a 5th ring to her collection, a simple band she purchased herself, representing her strength as an individual woman, complete whether or not she had a husband. Margaret lived to be 83 years old, sharp-minded and loving until the end. She died in 1941, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, her life full and complete. Her last words were simple. I have been so blessed, so very blessed. She was buried next to Ryder in the cemetery near Fort Worth. Her children placed something special in her casket before it was closed, something that told her entire story. On her finger were 5 gold rings, worn and precious, each one a chapter in the remarkable life of Margaret Davies Ramsey. But the story did not end with her death. The Davies Widows Fund continued its work for decades more, eventually helping thousands of women. The ranch remained in the family for 3 more generations. And the story of the cowboy who bought a widow's wedding ring and placed it back on her finger became a family legend, passed down through the years as an example of how one small act of kindness can change everything. Years later, one of Margaret's great-great-granddaughters found herself in trouble, a young widow with children to raise and no clear path forward. She sat in the old ranch house, now preserved as a family museum, looking at the photograph of Margaret and Ryder on their wedding day. "What would you do, great-great-grandma?" she whispered. And somehow, looking at that photograph, at the strength in Margaret's eyes and the kindness in Ryder's smile, she knew the answer. She would be brave. She would take help when it was offered. She would honor the past while building the future. She would love again when the time was right, because that was the legacy Margaret Davies Ramsey had left behind. Not just a widow's fund or a prosperous ranch, but the knowledge that life, no matter how hard, was always worth living fully. That grief and joy could coexist. That second chances were real. That kindness mattered. That love in all its forms was the greatest gift we could give or receive. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Margaret and Ryder and Thomas were together. All the love she had given and received throughout her remarkable life surrounding her like warm sunshine, like the glow of gold rings in the light, like the promise that no act of kindness is ever wasted, and no love is ever truly lost.